Guys, the battle for Bakhmut continues, and right now the most contested piece of terrain in the whole city looks like it's actually the junkyard. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It's December 9th, 2022. We're going to be breaking down everything that's been going on in this battle. Let's get into it. Okay, so the most recent updates. This is, of course, the terrain map, and you can see here that there's been some fairly significant changes to control of the city. First off, in the north, it looks like Russian forces have managed to advance somewhat to this tree line here, this forested area, where I suspect Ukrainian forces are going to be somewhat harder to dislodge simply because of the overhead cover provided by the trees and forest. But in the southern part of Bakhmut, you guys can see that actually this is being reported as a clarification that the mappers may have over-assessed Russian control, and that in fact this area here are actually still being contested. Now let's zoom in a little bit and get a little bit deeper perspective. So here is that region zoomed in. You can see that it is a mine here, and then here's the two major road intersections, and here's the reservoir. Now, we'll look over to Google Maps for an even more detailed look. This is Bakhmut itself. Here's the reservoir. Here is the open mining pit. And as you can see here, this is labeled as garbage dump. Now let's zoom in and take a look at what exactly is being fought over here. Well, first off, it looks like this garbage dump region, generally, these are pits or depressed areas. But in this case, it sort of looks like it might actually be a pile of garbage. Let's see. I don't know if Google will let me do a street view of any of this. Doesn't look like it. But nonetheless, this looks like a pile of garbage where junk is dropped off outside the city. Very environmentally sound, obviously. But what makes it dangerous is, of course, when you have big piles of, well, junk or big piles of anything, you have this very, very defensible position, right? The piles of junk, like piles of dirt, can absorb actually quite a bit of fire, and they can obscure the movements that are going on behind it. So it can be a sort of tough spot to navigate. Likewise, defensive positions dug in here, defensive positions dug in here can basically give control of these two major intersections. So whoever controls this high ground, which in this case is a junkyard, will control this major intersection, two major avenues of approach in the southeast portion of the city. Now, I suspect that Russian forces probably control this mining area. And again, like the junkyard, this has a lot of elevation changes, and because it's, well, looks like a strip mine, it looks like there's probably just a hole in the ground, which means that it's sort of a giant trench line. And the problem is that, as you guys can see, if Ukrainian forces are dug in here and Russian forces are dug in here, you have nothing but open terrain between the two. You have open terrain in which both sides have overwatch over the avenues of approach here and here. And so it means that it's going to be actually really hard to dislodge either force. Now, what you would normally do in this situation, if my assessment is correct, if this assessment is correct, right, where you have, and let's switch the layers, I'll show you guys what I'm talking about, right? You can kind of see it through this somewhat less robust layer here. You can see that they're assessing that in this case, they're assessing that Russia actually does control this junkyard and controls this region here, or at least that the junkyard is partially held by Russia. But what you would normally do under NATO standards is if you are trying to dislodge an enemy from this location, one option is to, of course, flank. You use your forces in this junkyard as a support by fire position, and then you attempt to execute a flank to one side or the other. Obviously, to the north, there's no cover and concealment, so it's going to be really hard to flank with a significant force, but you may be able to get away with it using this tree line along the road, but much more likely is going to be flanking to the south. And when you look at the more detailed control assessment, you guys can see that it almost looks like that might be what Ukrainian forces are trying to do, trying to take control of this region here. But it's tough to say, right? You can see this was the previous assessment of the location. And Ukrainian forces have, well, not dislodged the Russians from this junkyard. They've probably been trying to flank around here to the south, use this tree cover, and dislodge them from both the junkyard and from the mining pit. That's what I suspect is going on here. Let's get the cleaner looking map here. And when we zoom out, we can see there's a few other changes, right? But let's take a look real quick to the north. As we've talked about, in the northern part of the city, there's just so very few actionable terrain items. It's a tough place to maneuver, right? We'll zoom out here and use the more detailed map here. And here's the wood line that probably forms the limit of the Ukrainian lines in Bakhmut at present. You guys can see, in fact, we can even see here, this looks like some artillery fire. Maybe not. Those are pretty big. Those might be ponds. But you guys can see that you can dig in here, right? There's a lot of dense wood lines that can form cover and concealment, even in the winter when there's no foliage, and that it looks out over this large open area. So again, it makes sense to me that Ukrainian forces would try to take this wood line where they can use it for cover and concealment to move their forces. You can see there's a few routes where they can conduct resupply. This is a pretty good defensive position. In contrast to Russian forces who it looks like are going to have a hard time, right? There's some light woods here, but much, much harder. You can almost see where even the houses and structures aren't really concealed by this foliage. And of course, there is no foliage right now. And from E40 to the wood line is pretty open terrain. So the Russians definitely have their work cut out for them, despite having advanced up to this wooded area. Like the Ukrainians earlier we talked about, they're going to have to try to their best bet is probably to try to flank around, but that's going to be tough itself because these urban areas also, or suburban areas, also make great defensive positions. It's a really hard thing to discharge, and you could see if they tried to maneuver here through this empty field, they would actually probably encounter Ukrainian defenders dug in Pidhorodne. And they would just end up caught in the crossfire. This is the core problem that Russian forces are having in Bakhmut generally, is that, right, they're trying sort of to execute this flank, but it's just not very effective. They really are between a rock and a hard place in terms of trying to achieve any sort of maneuver on Bakhmut, right? They can get to they can't really do the encirclement because there's too many other villages serving as strong points, and they can't really push through block by block because they're simply too dug in. There's too much terrain. It's too hard to dislodge troops. And so they have no choice but to throw these human wave attacks again and again and alternate them with shelling in the hopes that they can dislodge the enemy, the Ukrainian forces. The only other notable news from this is, let's see. Oh, there we go. Yep. The only other notable news here is, of course, that at the very southern tip of the front, right, there's a Vodiane has been seized by the Russians, and you can see they are trying to encircle Avdiivka. But again, without, as we talked about, I think they're trying to seize this string of villages here in an effort to create an encirclement. But it's just hard, right? To finish the encirclement, they need to cross a lot of open terrain, and that's going to be really, really tough, and it's going to inflict a lot of casualties. Anyway, guys, that is all I had for you for today on the Battle of Bakhmut update. as always, if you want to see the uncensored combat videos, new video drops today. You want to become a member of the Patreon. Thanks so much to my Lieutenant tier patrons. You guys are the ones who make this possible. The link, as always, is in the description. You can also check out our sponsor, Ground News, for free. Link to that is also in the description. See you all next one.